Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. This is our first installment of what figures to be a great series of events for this fall. We're so excited that you have joined us live, and for those who are watching the recording of this, we hope you find the conversation useful and engaging. My name is Tim Horgan, and I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership organization that fosters discussion on current global issues and builds community by hosting distinguished speakers, organizes international exchanges through our partnerships with the U.S. Department of State, and holding educational programs. We are so grateful to our various members and donors who continue to support the programs that we run and in building a strong global community. We wanted to put a special thanks out to Barbara and Ivor Freeman, Pat Schlesinger, Bob Jones, and Happy Beal for joining us tonight. Some really great members of our organization. As a nonprofit, the Council is only able to continue its work through the support of our members and our donors. We humbly ask that if you enjoyed tonight's program, not only will you consider joining our membership, if you have not already, but you will let your friends know about our organization and our great programs. International affairs are important, and understanding these help to build a more peaceful and prosperous world. Please do consider joining our network or donating to the cause. Thank you to Karen Gilbert, Linda Kennison, Kay Mast, and Susan Parrott for your donations in support of this event. Also, as a nonpartisan organization, I would like to mention that the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire does not support, endorse, or promote any political candidate, idea, policy, or position. These programs are intended to provide a platform for discussion and information sharing. Therefore, the ideas expressed by tonight's speaker are his and do not necessarily reflect the ideas of the Council, its board, staff, sponsors, and supporters. Having said that, and seeing how today is primary day here in New Hampshire, we hope that you all got out to vote today. It doesn't matter who you voted for, but that you voted, because free and fair elections are not something that everyone has the privilege of participating in around the world. Please do not take this responsibility lightly. I do want to mention that we will be taking questions throughout the evening. You can send us our questions at council@wacnh.org or on Facebook or YouTube. Tonight, we are featuring a new option. We hope if you are watching on our website, in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you should see a blue icon, Facebook Messenger icon. If you click on that, you'll open a messenger box and be able to directly send us your questions. That way you don't have to leave the screen. Okay, now that you've heard all you need to hear from me, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Sawar Kashmiri. Sawar is a fellow with the Foreign Policy Association and applied research fellow at the Peace and War Center at Norwich University. He's an author of 3 books and a foreign affairs commentator noted for his expertise on US-EU relations, NATO, and US-China relations. A former international businessman, he served as a communications advisor to several Fortune 100 companies and the World Bank. As he brings a global perspective to his foreign policy and national security strategy. He hosted China Focus, a series of podcasts on US-China relations for the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And his latest book, China's Grand Strategy, Weaving a New Silk Road to Global Primacy, was published by Prager in July of 2019. Please help me welcome Sawar Kashmiri to the program.
Well, thank you very much, Tim Horton. I was going to call you Tim Horton. I'm in Canada, and all the coffee shops here are run by Tim Horton, so my apologies for that. It's really a pleasure. It's really a pleasure to be with your World Affairs Council in New Hampshire. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the world is a little bit of a snare right now, and so my own feeling is that us experts are kind of on a fine balance line here. And what is really needed is for Americans to get more involved in foreign policy. And that is a role that the World Affairs Councils fill so wonderfully. And so I am always pleased to be at a World Affairs Council function, and especially pleased to be with the New Hampshire World Affairs Council. You're not only a neighbor, but one of the leading World Affairs Councils in the country. So, and thank you, of course, for inviting me, and for all of you who have joined in. I will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes so that we can leave enough time to answer questions. Now, as everyone knows, China is kind of in the woodshed, right, and has been for a while. There is talk of disconnect, there's talk of uncouple, there's talk of we need equality, there's talk of we cannot go on trading like this and get poorer and poorer. As I see it, the big issue is, okay, so we decouple, so we cut all the wires. So what comes after that? And there is silence when one asks that question, or there are myriad of voices, bubbles, no real strategy behind that. I should also tell you, it is my feeling, and I'm sure that China is equally perplexed by this, that there is a growing consensus in Washington, across the aisle, by the way, that we must, the US must do something about China. Whether Mr. Biden is our next president or Mr. Trump continues his presidency, I don't believe we are going to see much of a change in that. Perhaps there will be some softening in the approach with Mr. Biden, but the end result I don't believe will be very different. I hope you're going to be making notes and asking a lot of questions, because that's where both of us learn, right? I also feel very strongly that one of the reasons we don't have a well thought out strategy about China is because a lot of Americans and a lot of us experts, and I stress the word us experts, do not look at China as it exists today. There's still some hangover of our grandfather's China. And I am going to try today to start by on a lighter note, actually. I'm going to ask a few questions. And then at the end of those questions, I'm going to ask you how many of them you thought were true, how many of them you thought were false. And after that, I'll drill in a little bit to some of the key questions, where many of which form the main part of my last book, which is China's Grand Strategy, Weaving a New Silk Road to Global Primacy. So I'm going to ask these questions. I'm going to ask you, if you'd make note of it, how many you think are true, how many are not. After that, I'll dig in a little more into some of the questions. And then finally, I'd like to give you my 2 cents worth of where I think policy making, strategy making in America should start. And I do that not because I have all the answers, but I would like to stick my neck out a little bit. But I also do it as a point of departure for those of you who are watching, so that during the Q&A, you can question me, I can question you, and perhaps you have better ideas. So here we go. I'm now going to read out statements, and you make a note of whether they're true or false. First one. China is now the largest economy in the world. 2, China creates 2 billionaires every month. 3, China will have lifted all its citizens out of poverty by the year 2020. 4, over 80% of world's trade is still done in US dollars. 5, America would most likely lose a war with China in the Indo-Pacific. 6, Saudi Arabia is China's largest Middle East trading partner. 7, wealth inequality in China is a serious problem. 8, China spends more on environmental and sustainability issues than the rest of the world combined. 9, the US trade deficit with China is larger now than it was 4 years ago, tariffs, sanctions notwithstanding. 10, there is no evidence at all that China wants to export its ideology around the world. Number 11, the US has the deepest and broadest financial markets in the world. Number 12, containment, the US Cold War strategy that destroyed the Soviet Union, will not work against China. 13, China is the largest car, aviation, luxury goods, cell phone market. Number 14, China is a nuclear power with the ability to strike any city in the US. The last one, the US has never faced a competitor that is its equal in economic, industrial, and military strength. Okay. So now, all those how many do you raise your hand if more than half of the questions I asked you said were true? Okay. Well, let me make this simple. You should have answered yes to every one of the questions I asked you. Every one of the questions I asked you is correct. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill into some of these questions. The first one is China is now the largest economy in the world. Economists count wealth, a country's wealth, by gross domestic product, right? And there are two ways to count a country's wealth. One is by the gross domestic product. The gross domestic product can be counted in two ways by economists. One is by simply exchange rates, but the other one, which most economists think is a truer measure of GDP, is purchasing power parity, or PPP for short, which measures equivalent parcels that can be bought in countries. By that measure, PPP, China is now the largest economy in the world. Roughly 23 trillion versus America's 21 trillion. The other point to make there is that China is not just rich, but it's very rich. It's now creating 2 billionaires a month. Remember that China opened up to private enterprise just 20 years ago, so this is quite an accomplishment. Let me drill in a little bit into this statement of mine that China will have lifted all its citizens out of poverty by the end of 2020. That is quite a statement, isn't it? Well, it happens to be true. In the last 3 decades, China has lifted almost 800 million people from poverty, abject poverty, to lower middle class. 800 million people. Roughly 3 decades ago, 92% of Chinese were at the poverty level. Today, there are about 5%. And the terms poverty level and out of abject poverty and so on, these are terms that are defined by the World Bank. So what I'm giving you are statistics that the World Bank puts out, right? So in 3 decades, that's what's happened to China. And I would urge you to just sit back and think about what's happened in our country, the United States, in the last 3 decades. What's happened to the middle class, what's happened to the low class. Okay, so China, my book argues that China is following a 3-part grand strategy. The first part was to get rich, which it has already accomplished. The second one is to make its coastline inviolable to American pressure. And it's very close to doing that. So the way that America projects, as many of you who've served in the armed forces will know, projects power into the Pacific is through its Navy, largely by the 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carrier attack groups that can show up overnight and carry more firepower than most countries. Well, China does not have as big a defense budget as the US does. Our defense budget, as you know, American defense budget is around 700 billion. Chinese defense budget is around 400 billion. So what China decided to do is develop layers upon layers of rockets, missiles, batteries to do one thing: shoot down aircraft and sink American boats. With the result that today, the American aircraft carriers will find it very hard in times of conflict to come within 1,000 kilometers of the Chinese coast. That is the status of the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force. So American operating radius, less than 1,000 kilometers. After that, the carriers will probably be sunk. So that's item two. The third part of the grand strategy is to become the most influential country in the world. And that's what their Belt and Road Initiative is all about. The Belt and Road Initiative is the larger part of my book. By the way, I'd like to leave you, if you're interested, in a book that came out recently that talks about the defense issues that I've just mentioned, about how the American Navy can't operate within 1,000 kilometers in conflict. The book is Kill Chain, K-I-L-L, Kill Chain, and it was written by Christian Brose, B-R-O-S-E. Christian was Senator McCain's key defense advisor. It's an easily read book with a lot of rather frightening numbers and information in it. So if you're interested, that's the book to go to. So the Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese project that is meant to connect China to over 100 countries and the countries to each other. As you may know, China has spent an enormous amount of time building infrastructure. In the last 3 decades, infrastructure has been a driving force of the Chinese economy. And what China wants to do is take its now proven formula for creating wealth, raising its citizens' standards of living to over 100 countries. And in the process, connect the countries to one another and to China. This project is called the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI for short. So it's a prize pet project of President Xi Jinping, and they've budgeted over $1 trillion to execute this project. And it already, it was announced in 2013 and is already showing rapid progress and results. So bridges, within this project, China's building bridges, it's building roads, it's building tunnels, it's building ports, it's improving ports, it's laying fiber optic lines. So today there are 30 to 40 trains that run from China to Europe and beyond. Ports like Piraeus in Greece and Hambantota in Sri Lanka are thriving. That used to be small villages or decaying ports are now thriving ports, making money for China, making money for the local countries. This is the kind of huge global enterprise that China is bent on taking worldwide. And I leave it to you to imagine the influence that this will have on the countries. I would also like you to think about, is there anything comparable that the United States is doing? Now, the World Bank estimates that it will take roughly $3 trillion a year for decade to build the kind of infrastructure that China is attempting to build with $1 trillion. But China is using the $1 trillion as starter money. The rest of it will come from private enterprise. So there is not a bank, an international bank in the world today that is not involved with China in financing its Belt and Road initiatives. So that's the third leg of the strategy that China is working on. I should also tell you that in becoming rich, China also has created a lot of inequality, right? Because the parts of China that grew were the coastal ports, the huge manufacturing plants on the coast. As you move farther west, through the rural areas, as you get to Xinjiang, China's population becomes less wealthy. And so one of the things that the Belt and Road Initiative is doing is connecting roads, connecting ports, connecting pipelines to the west and south of China so that it can begin reducing this inequality. One more objective of the BRI, the route from the Indian Ocean coming through to the South China Sea goes through a small waterway between Singapore and Malaysia called the Malacca Strait. At times it is only 30 to 50 miles broad. Roughly 70% of China's trade passes through the Malacca Strait. The Navy calls this a choke point because if you can bottle up that tiny 50 to 75 miles, you can cut off the trade with China and cause it real harm in case of war. So what China is trying to do is create alternate pathways coming into China using the Belt and Road Initiative. So that is where China is. And I want to talk about just one more item that I talked about, and that amongst the points that I said, and that is that China isn't just stopping with Europe. Its Belt and Road Initiative goes from China to Europe, from Europe to Africa, so that these countries span a very large part of the world. Roughly 65% of the world's population will get into being connected to each other and to China with the Belt and Road Initiative. And believe me, the US has nothing that it can compete with on the Belt and Road, with the Belt and Road Initiative. There's nothing in the works, there's nothing at all. And I believe it's a real hole in America's strategy. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And I would like to now, just in the remaining time that I have, offer you some thoughts of how we might try to work with China. Because, it's easy to say, let's decouple. It's easy to say, let's disconnect. But let me just remind all of you who are listening in that China is today the largest automobile market, aviation market, luxury goods market, cell phone market, right? It's often, the word Cold War is used a lot lately because, it's what sank the Soviet Union. Well, in the best year, the trade that the United States did with the Soviet Union on an annual basis is done every day between China and the United States. Right? The tussle between the Soviets and Americans was existential. Soviets were financing revolutions, mayhem all over the world, right? Remember Germany, Baader-Meinhof gang, Italy. China is not doing any of that. China is not doing any of that. So this idea that you can contain China or you can decouple, is not well thought out, in my opinion. The largest part of Chinese trade is in Asia. transatlantic business used to be Americans' forte. Today, Asia does more transatlantic business with, I'm sorry, not transatlantic, but more business with Europe than America does. So this idea of we'll decouple, we'll make them bend over, the Soviet Union containment, please, in my opinion, not true, won't happen. So where does that leave us and what should we be thinking about? That's where I'd like to spend the remaining few minutes that I have. First of all, I hope some of you know that there is already a lot of cooperation, business and otherwise, between China and the United States. Right? There are hundreds of scientists, American scientists, working with Chinese scientists to come up with a vaccine. Just 3 months ago, a big real estate tycoon in Shanghai gave $100 million to Harvard to develop a study to study pandemics. But best of all, I like to think about one of the main commuter subway lines in Boston has their commuter cars being built by one of the largest contractors, Chinese contractors, that works on the Belt and Road Initiative. Right? Those cars began delivery 3 months ago. Massachusetts picked this company not only because they were the least expensive. I talked to the then cabinet official who negotiated the deal with China, and he said, we looked at all the big players, Kawasaki, Bombardier, Hyundai, and of course the Chinese Rail Corporation. And he said, we picked the Chinese company because not only were they the low bidder, but of all the companies we looked at, all the global companies we looked at, they were the only ones that have always met their target. All the others have a record of missing it, right? So we have, so there used to be a railroad assembly plant in Springfield, Massachusetts, which was rusting. So the Chinese said, okay, we'll build this plant up. We'll take some of your union engineers to China. We'll train them on how these subways come together. And then we'll rebuild this factory. So today, all these rail cars come in boxes. They're assembled in Springfield, Massachusetts, which now has 200 people working for it, 200 Massachusetts workers working for it. And more importantly, Massachusetts has now started to develop an export business. Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles in the works, is negotiating to get commuter railway cars from Massachusetts. So it's not that we're not already working with China. It's just that it's not well known, one, and two, politics is taking over from business sense. Now, this is not to say that China has not done many of the things that people say should be corrected, right? For example, it still considers itself a developing nation and is given privileges under the World Trade Organization, World Bank rules. So is that correct? I don't think so. I don't think it should be called a developing country anymore, right? So, and then there are other issues of not giving enough access to foreign companies to have ownership of large corporations or businesses in China, to provide equal access, to provide a number of things that in many cases were promised by China when it joined the World Trade Organization and was supported by the United States. But the European Union has the same issues with China. It's not disconnecting. It's not saying, hey, let's go home. It's engaged in fierce negotiations with China. And as we speak, the foreign minister of China was in Europe just 3 days ago and went through 6 or 7 of the most important countries and knows very clearly that it now needs to make a decision, that China now needs to make a decision, and the EU has given it a certain timeline and said that, we don't think we can continue on like this. We'll still trade with you, but let's get serious. Now, that's a very nice strategy instead of saying, we'll take our marbles and go home. So let me end by pointing out some ways in which I believe we should tackle engaging with China in a big way. Right? Let's talk about, first of all, the COVID-19, right? It's played havoc with the world economies. America and China are the two superpowers. Both have the wealth to develop the vaccines, to transfer them around the world. Both have the wealth to jumpstart post-COVID economies. How about trying to pull the two together? How about taking the leadership? That's what the United States is known for, right? Leadership. How about taking leadership and saying, let's see if we can start a project to do all that? Secondly, as we all know, American infrastructure is in shambles. You look at Vermont, you look at New Hampshire, you look at all around the country, and roughly a third of all the infrastructure is decaying. China has become a master at creating infrastructure. Now, here's a statistic which you can think about over coffee tonight. Between 2011 and 2013, China used more cement in its infrastructure than America did in all of the 20th century. All of the 20th century. China has 25,000 kilometers of railroad track on which trains run. High-speed trains run. High-speed defined as over 250 kilometers an hour. China's highways now are testing solar recharging strips. What they will do is recharge electric cars as they're driving over the highways, right? So China has enormous technology invested, learned in infrastructure. How about saying, hey, China, we don't mind linking up with you to build American infrastructure. We have all these banks on Wall Street that have raised all these funds for infrastructure. Let's use that money. Let's use American people. Let's use your technology where it can help us. And let's start a project to rebuild American infrastructure. Is that pie in the sky? Perhaps. But sometimes, pie in the sky really works. Let me talk about the moonshot, right? President Kennedy said, an American would land on the moon within this decade. Well, I was in aerospace engineering school then, and I remember all of us saying, my God, what is the president saying? We don't even have the rudiments of the technology or the materials to make this happen. There isn't the navigation system, isn't the metals, isn't the heat shields, nothing. How are we going to go to the... Well, I now believe that President Kennedy knew all that, but the Russians were eating our breakfast when it came to space. They'd launched the first Sputnik, their satellite that put the first man into space. American rockets were exploding when they were launched, and it was very embarrassing. So President Kennedy, knowing what Americans can do, American engineering, American creativity, laid this challenge. He laid this inspiring challenge, and you all know what happened, right? An American landed on the moon within the decade. But look at what that government expenditure did for the following centuries. America was the leader in miniaturization, in computers, in space navigation, in the GPS came out of that. And oh, by the way, so did the non-stick frying pans, right? The ablative material that was developed to protect the astronauts' nose cone during re-entry found its way at one point into frying pans. So thinking big is not bad. And I would like the government to think big, the United States government to think big, to put a lot of money into working with China on issues like infrastructure, but B, into developing American or launching American creativity. We need quantum computers. We need even denser connections, chips. All this business of containing China, this is all defensive. I don't believe that America became great by playing defense. I think we ought to go on the attack. We ought to finance development and all the technologies that are going to carry us through the next few decades. So those are some of my ideas on what I think we ought to do and not do. And hopefully you'll have some ideas as we talk through in the Q&A period. But let me end where I began, that it is time for America to develop a strategy for China based on China as it is today. And I will repeat one of the points that I made when I started, that America's really never had a competitor that was as strong, stronger in some ways than America is, was the same height, was as rich, and isn't going anywhere. The next century is going to have America and China as the two superpowers. And let me hasten to add, America isn't going anywhere, right? We have the biggest, broadest markets, we have universities, we have, research centers. So how do the two superpowers coexist going forward? To me, that's the central issue that America, all of us, have to face as far as American foreign policy and strategy towards China. And I just think it's important for people like you, and that's why, again, I applaud the New Hampshire World Affairs Council for letting me speak. You will have a lot of speakers, very important speakers going forward, and I'm sure China will be a topic they would like to address. So I would like to leave you with my thoughts on it and take any questions, open it up for discussion. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm prepared to answer any and all of your questions. And if I can't handle that, Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Sawar, for your wonderful comments. We've got a lot of great questions coming in already, but please do keep sending them in. We'll try and get through as many as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. So we'll start off with one that actually turns your question back on you. What are the best and worst possibilities in the relationship with China, in your opinion?
Hey, you promised me no difficult questions, Tim. What is this? The first one?
That's the easy one so far. We'll get into real tough ones later.
Well, the worst possible scenario is Americans will get poorer and China will get richer. That's the worst case. The best case scenario, and I want to ask the questioner if I may parse that a bit, the best case scenario would be that America does not suffer lasting damage and that America maintains its creativity and its competitiveness with China.
Okay. We also have a question of how does China afford its huge expenditures in military and also in its Belt and Road Initiative? And I add to that, particularly in light of the coronavirus pandemic.
So I started off by saying that America today has a greater GDP than the United States. Okay? So that's one part of the answer. But the bigger part of the answer is that China's defense budget is a little more than half of the United States. So it has a greater GDP, but a smaller defense budget. Okay? It has budgeted $1 trillion for the Belt and Road Initiative. Remember what I said, that the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank says that to truly make a difference in infrastructure in all these countries, it will take $3 trillion for over a decade, or $30 trillion. And that money is starting to be pumped in by the large international banks. So what China's done is taken its vision to do two things. One, it knows that when it connects, builds infrastructure in all of these countries, it'll be Chinese equipment that's used. It'll be Chinese trainers who will be there. So it uses spare capacity to help all these people, right? It also connects them, and Central Asia is full of raw materials, right? So it connects them to China so that it's already safeguarding its sources of wealth in the future. And thirdly, the influence part of it. I mean, think about being a poor family living, you pick it, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. You don't have enough money to eat properly. You don't have enough money on clothes. Your children can never go to college. You can never take a holiday. You don't have medical expenses. And along comes someone, builds all these roads and tunnels. You now have access to other countries. And they say, think well of China. All this business of democracy and free press and unfettered elections. I mean, what have they done for you? So another part of this whole scenario is, where will democracy be 20 years from now? Will it still be the be-all and end-all of every country? It's a question worth pondering. But I think I've answered your question, I hope, as to how China can afford it. It is rich.
All right. We've had a lot of questions along this line, so I'll pick just one of them. But can we, in the West, maintain peaceful and profitable relations given our different ideologies? What do we need to do to achieve this?
What a great question. You really started off with three of the best questions, mainly because I hadn't prepared for them, and so I have to think, but they really are. How would I like to answer this? Thank you for the question. I'd like to answer it by saying that the world has changed. It is not a homogeneous world anymore, or at least the power structure is not homogeneous anymore. Asia is going to be the driving force in the new century. It's not going to be Europe and America. Not that they're disappearing, but let me give you a statistic that is often found in Asia when I'm there, and they write about a lot. Since the beginning of history, recorded history, right? You go back to year zero, take it through to the year roughly 1600. Guess where the majority of the world products came from? Over 75–80% of the products came from China or India. That was the center of manufacturing, trade, ideas of the world. So in Asia, they say, okay, so for 200 years, there was the Industrial Revolution, and then there was colonization. You guys came in, took what you wanted, left us more poorer than we were before you came. Well, guess what? Now, all of that is over. Now we have a larger population, we have a larger GDP, we have larger manufacturing facilities. So don't be surprised if going forward, the situation becomes what it was, that we're the drivers of business and wealth. So this idea that we have different ideologies, yes, is true, but Americans and Europeans will have to learn to live with the idea that they're no longer calling the shots. It will be a different world, but I happen to believe it will be a richer, more beneficent, and a healthier world if we can make that happen. And that's why I go back to what I think is a big issue for American foreign policy. How are we going to exist in such a world?
All right. So now to the real tough questions.
Oh.
We've had a lot of questions about Uyghurs in China. We'll pick this one to go with. Is it realistic to believe that the U.S. will cooperate with a country that has 2 million Uyghurs that are, in essence, in concentration camps?
That is a tough question, but it's also a very realistic one, right? So two things come to mind. Does the United States apply this measure equally around the world? Right? So that's the first thing to think about. Just yesterday, there were two, I'd say Burmese, but really, we shouldn't use that word anymore, that came out and showed how these Rohingya Muslims were killed, massacred upon the orders of the army, Myanmar army, right? We're still continuing to do all kinds of business with them. And you can go around and pick these issues around the world. So the first part of my answer would have to be, will we apply this measure of humanitarian behavior equally around the world? Right? That's one. Two, what good does it do for the United States to disengage from such an important issue? Right? The Europeans are not doing it. My own feeling is what the Europeans will do is what they've done in the past with other countries. For example, they made sure Israel knew that its large export market would be in trouble if they sent items that were made in the West Bank, because the Europeans believe the West Bank occupation is illegal. Others don't, but they do. And they said, hey, if you keep exporting, when we see something that says made in the West Bank, we'll send it back to you. We won't accept it. Israel changed, right? So my point is, what is the benefit to disengaging? The same thing happened when America walked out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They went ahead, China became the leader, and now the rules are all driven by China. Who won in that? I would submit the United States did not win that battle. We should have been at the table forming the rules. And I would submit that we need to engage with China, and we need to let them know that there's a certain moral compass here, and that certain things will happen, but we cannot disengage. So does that satisfy the questioner, or would they have a follow-up, you think, Tim?
If we see one come in, I'll definitely bring that up to our next question. But we've also seen a number of questions on China and technology, and so we'll take Alan Post. Thank you for your comment here. One thing bothering me is the Chinese policy to steal American technology, either by espionage or by establishing relationships with companies that have valuable intellectual property. We have a similar question. Can you please talk about the disparity of quality in goods and services produced in China? How can we include China in our sensitive areas when they steal and rob us daily?
Thank you again for that question. And that is a headline question, right? I mean, everyone right now is very bothered by it. Let me first of all say I do not agree with that statement that China is robbing us daily and making us poorer. I do not agree with that. It's really interesting when you talk about stealing technology, right? I mean, developing countries have always used technology from developed countries, right? If you look at the history of how Carnegie made his billions, it was through the Bessemer process for making steel. Well, that wasn't invented in America. That was invented in, if I remember correctly, Norway and England. You look at the light bulb. That came out of Poland, I forget, Eastern Europe somewhere. I remember when I left India, India was just, that was in the 60s, India was just developing its first fighter aircraft, and it asked a very famous German designer to come build it for India, to develop that technology. And the first thing India said was, hey, listen, you want this business, you're going to have to bring your technology with you and leave it here. Take the nuclear bombs in Israel. Israel didn't have that. They stole it from the United States. So my point is that getting information technology from developed countries is something that has happened forever. Now, having said that, what I really object to is a state policy that says, hey, this could be okay, so we're going to do it and make it routine and make it part of the government, right? I think that's something that needs to be looked at. But I would pose it that this idea that they're stealing us blind and so on, to me, it doesn't hold water. We are a free market country, the United States is. Corporations have a choice whether to go and do business in China or not. They don't have to give out their secrets when they go there, right? Is it fair for China to do this? That's a different issue. That's where we need to engage, and the European Union is engaged in it. So, sorry, but I treat that with some cynicism. Parts of it are true, but not all.
And we did hear from the questioner about the Uyghurs, and they said, yes, you answered their question. So good job there.
Oh, thank you.
All right, moving on to clean and renewable energy. Is that an industry that the U.S. has effectively ceded to China as the current administration continues to push for more fossil fuel infrastructure?
I'm so happy that you asked that question. Wish we were looking at one another so I could come over, shake your hand across the stage. It goes back to what I really believe, that I think what the United States needs to do is develop this policy of massively funding the technologies that will create wealth in the first half of the century. We need to be developing the environmental, the climate. We need to tackle climate change. We need to be developing dense chips, manufacturing, all of these things. And I just think that it won't be long before we show leadership in some of these areas. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's what we need to be doing. Unfortunately, it's going to take a lot of wealth, and it's going to take a lot of government intervention. I don't think private corporations can do it on their own. So I hope that we stop thinking of this, the government should not be involved, government is the problem, and think of John Kennedy, think of what happened for the next few decades after the space shot, and use history. Sometimes I think we don't think enough about history. There's a great article by Margaret Macmillan, the famous Canadian historian, in this month's Foreign Affairs article, and she talks about just that. We need to be referring to history in creating foreign policy.
All right. Well, we do have a question in here. Let me see. Back to the Uyghurs. A little long, so sorry for covering your face here, but agreed, it is often better to be at the table helping develop the rules, but would the U.S. have cooperated with Hitler's Germany if there were viable opportunities to do so? By cooperating with China, is the U.S. condoning such actions?
Can you flash that question up one more time, please? Is that possible? Would the U.S. have cooperated with Hitler's Germany if there were viable opportunities to do so? China. Important question, a difficult question. Hitler was determined to create the Third Reich. Hitler was determined to wipe out everyone in Germany that didn't conform to the Aryan blood. It did a masterful job, and I use the word masterful, by almost eliminating an entire race, the Jewish race in Germany that had contributed so much wealth, so much literature, so much music, was the heart and soul of Vienna and large parts of Germany. China is not doing that. This is an internal issue to China, right? And as I said earlier, we need to be very careful here when we start laying out these broad strokes and measuring stakes, so that we use the same measurements around the world. And I won't go into other spots there, but this gentleman or lady who asked the question can think about it themselves. So China is not interested in pushing its ideology around the world. China isn't bent on destroying the United States or any other country. China is a living example of what Asians put before nationalism, which is wealth, riches, and their wallet. Right? That's what I think drives Asia. That's what I believe drives China. And I think that's an essential difference that we need to be thinking about. And that goes to the answer I gave about being engaged.
All right, I got to pull up this question because it's a shameless plug for our podcast. But in a recent Global on the Granite State podcast, the speaker mentioned that the Phase 1 deal with U.S. and China is on life support. Can you comment on trade relations? And that is our most recent Global on the Granite State podcast. Xiaoming Liu from the Eurasia Group was talking about TikTok and the trouble that they're having.
Right. That's, again, a great question, and it's so timely. It's so timely because, as I mentioned in one of the points I read at the beginning of this talk, Tim, with all the tariffs and all of the boycotts and everything else, the trade deficit with China has actually grown. It's larger now than it was when Mr. Trump came into office, right? So everyone's now trying to figure out, hey, what happened? Now, the Phase 1 deal, an essential part of that was that China had promised to buy certain 100 billion, I forget what, worth of farm goods and other goods from the United States, right? That doesn't seem to be happening. And I think it doesn't seem to be happening for two reasons. One, of course, is the pandemic, which nobody really saw coming, and that has derailed all economies. But beyond that, I think it's happening because the administration is continuing to take a tougher and tougher and tougher line. Lately, there's talk of looking at all the Chinese companies on Wall Street and making sure that their accounting firms are ones that are approved by American auditors, right? Today or yesterday, there was talk about looking at all of the clothing that comes in from China to see. So every day there's a ratcheting up. And I wouldn't be surprised if China feels that, hey, what's happening here? This looks like the boundary is moving almost every day as we speak. So I really don't know what the trade policy is anymore. I don't think there's a rational, well thought out policy. I think the policy is, as I said when I started, let's decouple, let's go home, let's take our marbles and stop this game. And that doesn't do anybody any good. That's what I think.
All right, I think we have time for one more question here. They're still coming in, but let's see. Let's go with this one. Is there anything we can do, anything the world can do to support Hong Kong? And I think Taiwan can be put into that category as well, with its democracy movement anymore, or is it out of reach due to being an internal issue for the Chinese as the Uyghurs are viewed?
The short answer is, I'm afraid not. Right, there are two things that I personally believe, and I've talked to a number of high-ranking Chinese officials, so it's based on some information. I honestly believe that China will not budge on Taiwan and Hong Kong. They consider them an essential part of China. I'm also convinced if Taiwan starts to head for independence, that China will invade Taiwan. As far as Hong Kong, I just finished speaking, long conversation with a big businessman in Hong Kong. And he said, what you watch on the Western screens is these people who talk about democracy. The wealth of Hong Kong came because of the huge business potential. He said, that's what keeps Hong Kong going. He said Hong Kong was the biggest port in China 20 years ago. Everything flowed through Hong Kong. Now it's the 5th largest port. There are ports in China that are much bigger than Hong Kong. Also, he said, I don't believe, and my business compatriots don't believe, that China is going to disappear as a financial center. It's much too big, much too dense, well-developed, so it will remain. And he said, me and my business people in Hong Kong really were tormented at these demonstrations that went on for a year. Everything was coming to a stop. So I just offer that as a view from Hong Kong. So my own position is China will not budge from Hong Kong and Taiwan.
All right. Just enough time for this great last question. where can we find more articles and information by and for Professor Kashmiri?
Oh my goodness. Did you plan this, Tim? If so, I thank you in advance. Listen, I'm flattered. So first of all, I have a brand new website, kashmiri.com, and please go there. And there are almost, I don't know how this guy who helped me with my website, he's a masterful designer, was able to dig up articles that I'd written discussing NATO in Brussels many years ago. But you'll find a lot of my articles there, even going back 8 or 10 years. So that's one place. I would urge you to buy my book on China strategy. Amazon, your local bookstores, best place to buy it. It was released in Washington last November. Tim, I think you were there. And our former Defense Secretary, Chuck Hagel, was kind enough to join me on stage to introduce the book. So those are two places. And just keep in touch. I'll be send me your name through the website. I'll add it to my mailing list. Soon there'll be a letter that goes out. And of course, if all else fails, call Tim Horton. He'll be up to date with listen, Tim, I want to say, and I'm repeating myself, but the work you do, the councils do, is really important. Especially, again, repeating myself, that it's not the experts. It's the people like you and who are listening to me, who we need involved in foreign policy. We really do. So thank you for that.
Thank you for joining us tonight and sharing your thoughts and insights on this very important topic. We really appreciate it. Before we finish up, I just want to remind everyone that our next event will be on September 23rd. It will be the first in our Global Tipping Point series focused on climate wars, climate change, and national security. We will be hearing from retired Admiral James Stavridis, the Honorable Sherry Goodman, and the Honorable John Conger. We do hope that you'll join us 5:30 on the 23rd. Thank you again to Sawar Kashmiri for his wonderful presentation. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful night.